Hey there, this is One Up in the Head, and today I got a special guest, which is basically a magical wizard, which is doing tons of shader stuff, and I'm honored to join me in this hopefully interesting discussion between me and XOR. So why don't you introduce yourself, and then we see how the whole thing flows.
Wow, thank you. That was quite an introduction. Like you said, I like shader stuff. I like doing some crazy graphics effects and stuff like that. People say that's the shader wizard thing, but I'm looking forward to having a little chat about GameMaker.
All right, so how can people follow you? So where is your reference or the stuff when they see like, hey, cool, I know this guy, or maybe you like to know him, where could they find you? What kind of sites are you doing? Because you do quite some significant content.
My main place that I would redirect people to is Twitter. I'm at XORDev, so XORDEV. I also have a website that I've been writing some shader tutorials for, gmshaders.com, and I have a newsletter that I'm working on, and that is also linked on my Twitter. Those are the main places.
Okay, sweet. So before we start into some more interesting topics about GameMaker, what kind of tools are you using? So just an overview, because you're more on the technical side, you do the graphics and so on. So what kind of tools besides GameMaker are you using?
Right. A big one is Atom. It's a text editor. It's just nice for editing basically any type of code. I use that all the time for just a variety of projects and even prototyping shader stuff. I also used ShaderToy, which is a website for writing shaders. It's a good way to compile and test ideas quickly, and there's a whole community around it. So you can find other shaders that other people have made, and it's just a great place to learn a lot of stuff. And then I also use GIMP, the image editor, which fulfills most of my image editing needs. I'm not much of an artist, but it's still useful to have, even for editing, noise textures or whatever texturing stuff that I need. So those are the three main ones I can think of.
Okay, sweet. So GIMP, I really dislike that program. I don't know why, but if you come from Photoshop and you just downgrade to GIMP, this is terrible. But of course, if you are less on the artist side, I guess. I'm not a huge fan of GIMP, but I can say that it can do everything that I need it to do. True.
And so, it gets me by. But I certainly wouldn't say it's the best editor out there. It's just, it has all the features that I need. And I'm familiar with it, so that's what I use.
Okay, sweet. So let's jump into the first part, the GameMaker part. What would you say out of the box? Why is GameMaker a pretty sweet IDE of making video games? So why is that your choice?
Well, the first reason is that it's really easy to learn. I started using it when I was around 10 years old, and I heard about it from a friend who was making games. I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. I want to try it. And so then I kind of got hooked on it. And me and my brother would make a bunch of little games. And ever since then, it just kind of kept growing and became a challenge in and of itself to make the next thing. So almost game making became a game. I would have a certain challenge where I'm like, okay, I want to make a 3D game. And so then I would try that, and I would learn a bunch of things along the way. And then I wanted to try to make a multiplayer game, and I would experiment with that. Usually I didn't get to the point of finishing a game, but I got pretty close, and I learned a ton of things along the way. So that's GameMaker's strength for me, is just it's extremely approachable, it's easy to learn, and I enjoy it, fun.
Okay, so you would, for beginners, definitely recommend GameMaker as TM, not sponsored and so on?
Yeah. It's just the accessibility and stuff. It's not because it's the game engine that everyone has to use. I don't have a problem with the other game engines out there, but I personally enjoy it the most, and I like the level of detail that it has, where it's not like it's holding your hand all the way along, where it sets everything up for you, all the lighting and everything. But it's also not completely bare bones, like writing an engine from scratch. It's like somewhere in between, where you can dabble a little bit into things and then rewrite the parts that you want to do. So like the graphics stuff, I love that, because all the shader stuff I can try out in a game pretty easily.
So what would you say in comparison to the other engines, which is of course appreciating what we're going to talk about later, because let's face it, GameMaker Studio is pretty sweet for 2D games, but if you look for lighting or light, it's pretty terrible. I'm not sure why they never did that.
I am a little bit rusty on other game engines. It's been a few years since I've tried them, but I have tried engines like Unity, Godot, Unreal, Construct. They all had different problems that I could get into as much detail as we like, but the main thing is I just find that it to be more overwhelming and slightly less organized. Like, the thing I liked about GameMaker is that it was the language was easy to learn. Variables and function names and things like that were predictable. Like, once you kind of get an idea, you could guess the name of what another function would be. And so it was easy to learn. When I was trying to learn Godot, it just didn't feel that way to me. It felt more like a hodgepodge of different programming languages and different styles and things like that put together. I know that Godot has a lot of neat features. Like, one of the things I would really love in GameMaker is to have like 3D model importing or 3D animation systems built in, because that's not something you really need to rewrite every single game. But apart from that, like, I really do enjoy the hands-on approach with GameMaker, where I actually have to write all the 3D rendering stuff myself, the cameras and the perspective and everything.
Okay, so do you think you started your career as a shader wizard out of necessity because it was so bare bones, or basically it was a sandbox in which you could play a lot?
Yeah, I think it was the sandbox thing, really. It was something where I was interested in game development and stuff because, I don't know, it's a level of control that you can have where you can experiment. I was a very curious child, and so it was fun to be able to test ideas in a virtual world quickly. And then the shader thing just kind of came in later. I'm like, oh, what's this thing? I want to learn a bit about it. And like I was saying earlier, it kind of became a challenge where I'm like, what does this do? And how does this work? And eventually I pieced it together, and I realized that I'm a very visual programmer. And so I really love to do code, but do it artistically and try to make it look a certain way, try to make it aesthetically pleasing. And so that was why it was fun.
That's kind of interesting, because normally you have like two kinds of programmers. One is definitely a little bit more, let's call it, just focused on code, but has no vein for graphics, for game feeling and so on. And then there's the other part, which is then, I guess, more a game designer, which is just basically about game feeling, graphics, how does it feel, how the game is actually living, but basically not terribly good with the math and, graphical systems, pipelines, and all that stuff. Kind of interesting. I thought you were more on the technical part.
It is. There's not that many programmers in that kind of a niche where they like the visual side of it, but they also like code. Because, I don't like hand drawing things, for example. That's one of my weak points. If I'm making a sprite or, making a tile set and stuff, I might do some pixel art stuff. That's about as far as I'm willing to go, because the more pixels, the more overwhelming it gets. So, like, just doing art manually is not really my thing. But when I can do something with code and actually just create a system that creates art, that's where I really get to have the most pleasure, and I really enjoy it.
Okay, interesting. Okay, good to know. But let's jump into the first thing. I guess you already talked about that in a video, which I'm going to link also. So with Dragonite Spam, you were talking about the GameMaker updates. What would you say was your biggest highlight here? So of new features, because there were quite a few.
Well, I'm going to do a follow-up video with Dragonite and 8-Bit Warrior, but basically what we're going to talk about, and I'll go in more detail there, but is a runtime update. They're going to update the runtime, and that has a bunch of implications that I could really get into. One of the things is compute shaders. They're going to add compute shaders. They're going to update shader languages for GameMaker. That's not until the beta of 2023, but I'm still getting excited about it already. So shader updates and things like that. There's surface updates and texture formats. Some of these things I'm kind of guessing what they're going to actually look like when it is added. But what I'm assuming is that means you can have different surface formats where you can have like a surface that only has one channel. So for example, a depth map, you only need the depth, so you can use 32 bits for just the depth data. And that would make things like shadow mapping shaders more efficient and better looking. Okay. Then you can, if they update it, they're going to have multiple render targets for GLS LES. That has a bunch of implications, but basically that means lighting systems are a lot easier to create in GameMaker. So that's going to be really fun to have like more like 3D lighting systems or 2D lighting systems. All of it is going to be more efficient and easier to create. Then they're adding, I'm assuming they're going to add vertex texture fetching, which basically just means in the vertex shader, you can actually sample a texture, which you can't do right now. If you could do it in GameMaker, that would make like 3D water shaders a lot more efficient, and then they could also react to objects on the surface of the water. So like special effects and stuff like that would be so much more powerful with just a simple change like that. And then compute shaders. Compute shaders are a field that I haven't fully dipped my toe into, but I'm definitely interested in it because I know it could be used for particle simulations or fluid simulations or physics simulation stuff, ray tracing systems, which I'm very interested in. There's lots of things that it could do, and it could do it really efficiently. So that's going to be fun to try.
Interesting. Okay, before we delve into, because that's actually a question where I wanted to ask you for beginners or for developers which are not sure. If you have particle systems and then you have shaders, but then both are being created by the graphics card. But let's say shaders are extremely efficient and fast, but particles in GameMaker are atrocious, to be honest. They are pretty slow. So
right.
What's the deal with that?
My understanding is that GameMaker's built-in particles are drawn using the CPU. So it's a bit like using draw sprite 1,000 times, you know, to draw each individual particle. And so that's obviously not going to be very efficient. But with compute shaders, perhaps they could rewrite the particle system using a compute shader. And so you can calculate the positioning of all the particles at the same time in parallel. And so that would be really interesting to see. And then of course in 3D, that's just not even possible right now. But you could have something with a compute shader where you could just calculate the positions of all the particles really quickly and have like millions of particles.
Interesting.
So that would be interesting. I'm sure that's not a high priority for them, and I don't know if that will happen or not, but you know, it will definitely mean it will be possible, and maybe people like me will end up writing one anyway, just for fun.
Then the next second question would be, because they're now introducing a particle editor, would it be similar to the Unity one, where you basically have seen like some really cool visual effects which you do in Unity, which I'm pretty envious, to be honest, because I would like to have that in GameMaker too. And they just do it with the particle editor. You just hop into YouTube and just Google for effect, and then you can just find it and copy it in 5 to 10 minutes. We don't have that. Is this going to be in that direction, or am I just dreaming about good features?
I don't know anything about like importing or exporting particles as assets. That might be possible, and that would definitely be cool. But my understanding is it's basically just taking the particle system that they already have and giving it a visual editor. So you can go through and you can adjust the slider, maybe with sliders or whatever. You can adjust the colors. You can adjust how long the particles last, their rotation, their velocity, you know, all of those different parameters. And you can do it visually without having to like write a certain set of variables, run the game and see how it looks, then change. If you want to make a change, you got to rerun the game over and over. So yeah, just having a visual editor, I think it's a huge step in the right direction. It's already something that needs to be tested manually, so you may as well be able to do it in the IDE rather than during runtime.
When you, for example, see lots of games which are made in Unity, you see they are pretty similar in concerns of their effects. Of course, they're looking amazing and sweet, so I love them. But if you see lots of indie games, so indie developer games, they have some sameneshness to them, even though I don't mind that. Is this, for example, a risk which, for example, GameMaker, if we are getting too many, let's call it, things which are too small, that we run into the same issue here, that we are getting boxed into some systems which are all, you know, just one standard?
Yeah, it is a bit of a concern. I know that there is already a little level of that with the current particle system, because there are certain particles that I see that I distinctly know are GameMaker. I see like a certain smoke particle, and I've seen that in actual games before, and I go, oh, that's a GameMaker particle. So I know this game was made in GameMaker. Or, yeah, mostly just like the different shapes and stuff. There's a few pre-made, preset ones that they have that are distinct. So it would be cool if they could add like more shapes to their default system, add a little bit more variety to it so that you have more combinations you can make and things aren't too much looking the same for every single game. And maybe even have like a button for randomizing the parameters just a little bit. That would be cool. So that way there's no like preset particle that every game uses. It's just every game uses a slightly different particle and they all look a little bit unique. So I can see it both ways. I could see people using it the same way in every game, but the potential is there for a lot of variety. And so ultimately I think it's a good thing. Whether or not people use it the best way, it's going to be great for GameMaker.
Since Opera pretty much took over, tons of changes have been done, and I'm pretty grateful for that. Of course, the community is a little bit split on that, because on the one side it's a subscription model now, which is of course funding, which is good. So there's a cash flow which is basically funding the whole thing. But of course on the other side we're getting tons of new features. What's your idea on that? So what's your opinion?
I've talked a bit about the subscription model before. I was not very happy with it when it first came out, and the reasoning behind that was because when I started using GameMaker, I started with a free trial that had no time limit. It was GameMaker 8 Lite Edition. I'm sure some people remember that. And basically there was no time limit, there was no time trial, but there was only a certain number of resources that you could have. And so I played around with it and tried to learn how to make games and stuff that way. And then I begged my parents to get me GameMaker 8 Pro Edition a few years later. And they did, because at the time I think it was like $50, but it was a one-time payment. You just buy it one time and then you have it forever. I probably would have had a lot harder of a time convincing my parents to get that if it was something that you had to subscribe to and you had to make constant payments for. So that was one of the concerns I had, is like, how do you justify it as a hobbyist or as a kid? You know, as somebody who's young, who's just trying to learn this stuff. I was kind of upset at first. Then they expanded the free trial a lot, to the point where there's no time limit at all. There's no limit to the resources. The only limitation is that you can't export to most platforms. You can only export to the Opera GX thing. I would have been happier if there was some way to export to Windows, but I understand that that's asking a lot for a free version. So overall, I'm mostly happy with the subscription model now. I'm more than happy to pay for it, because most of the money that I've made over the years has been coming from game development, and that's come from GameMaker in the long term. You know, like I've learned about game development through GameMaker. So, you know, I don't have any problem with paying for the development, especially in this age where every piece of hardware has software that needs to be updated. So computers are always updating, you know, phones are always updating. GameMaker is always going to have to update for those changes. So it just makes sense to subscribe to pay for it.
Okay, makes completely sense. So basically, on the one side, you have to pay it, but you have to pay for it, but you're getting some quality and you're getting really significant updates, because I can remember that it was kind of rusty before the acquisition. So that's all right, in my opinion.
Yeah, I am really happy when I can see, like they'll occasionally do like a humble bundle or something where you can buy 1 year's worth, and that's like a one-time thing. Obviously, it expires after a year, but that still seems good enough for me. And so I did a GameMaker giveaway on my Twitter at one point, because I'm like, yeah, that's cool. Maybe somebody who wants to try GameMaker and they have a year to make a game, well, now they can do it with that. So I'd love to see more things like that, humble bundles or whatever, where you could buy like 1 year at a time rather than making a regular commitment.
So where do you see GameMaker now concerning its place on the market? So for example, what I've seen, and this is kind of interesting, I never knew about that a lot of GameMaker licenses are in schools. But of course for learning this is great, but of course for professional development, it's something else. Unity isn't like that. So Unity is a little bit more complex, and therefore you got those kind of two groups. One are in school, which are just fiddling around with that. Hopefully they enjoy it. And then the other ones which are going really deep into being professional. So where do you see GameMaker in the future? Of course, this is asking a lot, but what would you say?
Well, I think GameMaker has a lot of strengths. One of the strengths that it has is the ability to make a game really quickly and make high quality ideas quickly. So for game jams, oftentimes the top games are GameMaker. Like disproportionately, the top games are GameMaker. So you might have out of the top 100 games, only 20% are made with GameMaker. But then in the top 10, 40% are made with GameMaker, something like that. Because GameMaker is really good at taking an idea quickly and prototyping it into something that's playable and that's fun. So for GameMaker, I think it would be great if they double down on that. They just set up different features and stuff to make the stuff that people already want to do a lot easier to do. Keep adding like visual editors and ways to adjust things hands-on, but they should not try to like hold your hand too much basically and set everything up for you. They should leave it open-ended. That's one of the strengths with GameMaker. And I talked about it with Dragon Knight and 8-Bit Warrior, where one of GameMaker's strengths is that it's pretty open-ended and you can kind of just come up with any idea from scratch and see where it goes from there. Okay. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see. GameMaker should keep focusing on making it easier to just prototype stuff, to come up with ideas quickly. And then down the line, I'd like to see them focus on 3D more. I think that's the reason that people are drawn to Unity so much, is because they see, wow, this game has really cool graphics and it was made with Unity. And they're like, I want to be able to do that. And you can't do that with GameMaker, not easily anyway. And so I would love to see them focusing on the basic tools for 3D and kind of get that in there more, where you could do, I don't know, 3D animation or anything, 3D editors, 3D whatever, just make it more approachable. And then GameMaker would have more appeal to a wider range of people.
But is it? But the point is, for example, if I'm thinking about Unity, I'm thinking about 3D. And then you got attacked on because it was basically attacked on a subsystem which is then made for 2D, because they said like, 2D we don't need. And GameMaker was actually and is still one of the best platforms to make 2D games. But for example, if you just go like, hey, we want to be like Godot or Unity, and then we switch to 3D, doesn't it basically lose its, it's easy way to approach and make a game?
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. I don't think that they should change anything that they're doing currently for 3D. I think it should basically just be an added layer if they can. So, it would be neat if in the room editor there was a way to, I don't know, like a 3D mode or something like that, and you can see the different layers as 3D layers instead of just 2D layers. And then you can set up a 3D camera instead of a 2D camera. So if you could integrate that in such a way, and this is all theoretical, I'm just coming up with ideas, but if you could implement that in a way that is added on top of what they're already doing really well, I think it could help just to bring in a few more people, and get some new, fresh ideas. Because I know a lot of people want to do 3D stuff, but they're just put off by the initial stages, which are really hard. Like learning about vertex buffers is really hard. Learning about 3D cameras and the matrices involved and stuff, that part is hard. Once you get past that, it's easy, relatively, in my opinion. It gets a lot easier once you get past the camera and the vertex buffers and the models and all that stuff. That's my hope, is they can just make those parts a little bit easier to enter into that. And it doesn't have to be, Unreal Engine or anything like that. It can just be pixel art 3D games, and that's totally cool. And it would just open new possibilities. I think for GameMaker to do well long term, that's a branch that they really need to go down. They need to work on that more, because I don't know, it's got a lot of appeal to it. 3D stuff is appealing. It is to me too, so I hope that would bring in new people.
What I've seen, GameMaker is number 3. So we got Unreal, number 1, Then we got Unity, and GameMaker is already on the third place concerning
Right.
most popular. So.
Yeah, that's really impressive, like considering GameMaker has been around for a long time, and the fact that they're able to maintain themselves and still keep up to date. And I imagine after Opera took over, that probably boosted the numbers recently. Like the updates are a lot more consistent. I've seen more like faith in the community. Like people are more involved and more excited about that, and I am too. So I don't know. I think that sort of morale boost matters more than the technology itself.
Godot actually, concerning units, I guess Godot is still leading in contrast to GameMaker. But I would say if you get something for free, and this is of course a hot topic once again, then you maybe don't invest into that. So this is a little thing which I find fascinating. So for example, if you pay once $5, then you're like, I'm going to squeeze out everything which I can from those $5. But if you get Godot for free, you can delete it later on. You don't care.
Yeah, and maybe there's a point to be made with subscription models where it's even a step further, where you're making a continual commitment. And so you want to produce something with that, or you're going to cancel your subscription.
Alrighty, so let's switch topics to more universal things. Or would you like to add anything to GameMaker which you want to talk about, which is not on my list?
We could talk about the effects layers for a little bit.
Oh, sweet. So let's jump right into it. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of effects layers. I think that's an amazing addition to GameMaker because most people don't want to write shaders. I do. I'm in the minority though. Most people just want to have their game look a certain way. They want to use, certain blurs or whatever. There's a certain set of effects and stuff that they want to add as a post-process effect. And so just having a way to do that visually, and you can visualize it in the IDE and everything, I think that's amazing. I would love to see more stuff along those lines. Just a way to visualize your ideas, and you don't have to write code. I still will, because I will. But having a system like that in place, I think can't be a bad thing. It's only a good thing. Curious what you think about that, though.
To be honest, I am the biggest fan of the FX layer. This is the cheap man's way to make a great effects without actually understanding anything about that. So this is a great tool. But of course, I cannot compare myself to you because you are really interested in writing shader code. For me, I couldn't get into it. It's difficult. It's really difficult. Of course, it's rewarding once you get into it, but it's a slog.
Well, and yeah, I'm trying to think beyond myself because I recognize I'm definitely in the minority when it comes to all that stuff. Like people just want to make a game and they want it to look a certain way, and they might spend 5 minutes looking online for different shader examples, but if they don't find the thing they're looking for, they'll just give up and move on. That's fine. That makes sense. So to have something like that natively built in GameMaker, and it's not going to have everything, I'm sure, but it still is. It's a tool that will point people in the right direction, and it'll get people thinking a little bit more about the polish of their game and just making things look better. So I'm happy. I think that's a cool idea. That's about all I have to say about it, but yeah.
Just one thing, I'm not sure if you know it or if you have any inside knowledge which you can share or cannot, because this is then wild speculation from my side, because I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the FX layer will be later on expanded in the regard that, for example, that you can build your own FX layer. So basically you have a distortion shader which is distorting for a shockwave. So these things could come. That would be a sweet addition, by the way. Do you think this will be at some
I think
point
that
possible?
goes a little bit beyond what I'm comfortable talking about, but that certainly would be cool. That's all I'll say.
Okay. Got it. No problem. So to round it off, I would say FX layers is a beautiful thing, and I must say, in my videos, if for the subscribers to my channel, they know I pretty much abuse it all the time because the underwater FX layer is just, I love it. So you can do so many great things with that.
But the one that I found myself using the most is the distort one, because there's many different ways you can use it. You can use any sort of distortion texture. And so one of the examples I posted on Twitter was water droplets. People were asking about how to do water droplets in GameMaker. And all you need to do is use the distort filter, and you can look up any normal map of anything you want, basically. So I just looked up water droplet normal map, and I used that as a distortion texture, and it just works perfectly. You just slap it right in and it works. So that's a cool one. I'm really happy with that.
Okay, so which one would you say is the least? Of course, maybe it's a very unfair thing to ask, but which one would you say is the least used FX, which you see in there?
Probably, I would say one of either like the color tint or there's a desaturation filter. And I just feel like those, well, I mean, there are times where you'd want a grayscale effect and stuff, but I would feel like those are probably some of the most limited of the filters out there. A lot of the other ones have more room for adjustment and things. So that's my opinion.
Okay, so I'm not sure how well you are versed, for example, in graphical trends. So, for example, hardware and software, because this is, of course, relevant for people who are a little bit, let's say, have a higher affinity for graphical manipulation, which is, of course, then your part. We have, for example, the trend of ray tracing, if we want to go on that, because this is now the hot iron, and this is getting sold that this is the best and so on. But if I see videos with ray tracing on and off, it's not that huge. Of course, it's a nice detail,
right,
but it's eating up lots of resources. So is that worth it, or is it just to showcase?
Yeah, so I don't know too much about the hardware side of it. I think most people don't really. It's hard to get details about how it all works. But what I can say is from the software side, I definitely think it's cool to be researching this field. I don't think it's ready yet. You know, like if you do the ray tracing stuff in games, most of the time you have to have a non-RTX version, a non-ray tracing version. So like you if you're going to do ray tracing reflections and shadows and stuff like that, you still have to have like a screen space version implemented in your game that is not going to rely on those pieces of hardware, because you're trying to make a game that's usable across all hardware. So maybe down the line in like 10 or 20 years, they'll have ray tracing cores in every single GPU, and we can use it all the time, and that would be cool. But at the moment, we're not there, and so it just kind of seemed like an extra feature that most people are not going to use.
Another thing, so for example, if you see shaders as a thing, because let's say 10-15 years ago, I guess shaders weren't such a prominent and known feature, and today basically shaders are every developer needs to know about. So what would you say, what is the relevancy of shaders today?
It's definitely an interesting field. I don't think there's probably enough people researching in it, because, you know, people are getting too familiar with using the regular polygon draw pipeline and stuff like that. You just take a default shader and then you slap it in. But like, I think there should be more research into different types of rendering and different types of systems, like, you know, ray tracing, ray marching, voxel tracing. There's all these different types of rendering systems. So I think it's definitely an interesting field to get into. If anybody is interested in that sort of thing, I would say definitely you should go into it. If you find those visuals cool, they're very rewarding to make. So definitely you should try it. But for everybody else, I think it's fine. Fine to not touch it. You know, if you're not interested in it, somebody else will figure it out, and that's totally cool too. It's not for everybody.
If you are really interested in shaders and graphical computation, is that a field for the future? So if you say like, hey, this is where the gold bars are, so this is the new technician guy, which is definitely needed?
For sure, because it's probably one of the more new fields in computation. There's so much to learn still, so much that has been unexplored. So that's one reason to do it. Or even just for games right now, like if you're focused on game development, then you can find ways to make your game look like no other game just by the visual effects and by writing your own shaders and stuff. So like games out there today, and that's one of my critiques against Unity, is that the lighting always looks the same to me. I can identify when I see a 3D game using Unity, the shading looks a certain way, and I'm very familiar with it. So I would rather, in a way, more people at Unity were writing their own lighting shaders and their own systems and stuff to do things a little bit differently, because then their game would have more character. Okay. So that's what I would say is there's research potential long term. There's a lot of future in it, and presently there's a lot of room to be unique and to make something that nobody's ever seen before. Definitely an interesting field to look into.
Other thing, because this is, I guess, very, very recent. Have you been looking into the Unreal Engine and the newest one? Concerning and the whole presentation?
I'm not too familiar with it.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, So this could be interesting because they revealed their newest engine, and I must say, before you used Unreal, that was first of all for professionals. So for example, if you see those car commercials, they are pretty much made in Unreal. So this is just amazing. The detail is great, but the rendering took ages. Now they got some new techniques. But of course, if you're not familiar and with my half knowledge in this kind of regard, then we can skip on that.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say is I use GameMaker partly because I really like to write everything myself and not use pre-existing systems. And that's what I found with a lot of people that use GameMaker for 3D stuff. They just like it for the thrill of exploring, exploring new territory in code and learning new things. So I'm not super familiar with what other engines are doing because I just want to do my own thing and I want to make something that is original that you haven't seen elsewhere.
Nope.
But yeah, that's all I can say on that. And it's more visual and hands-on. But, I just like GameMaker and I like the limitations. I like the 3D creation from scratch. And I still don't think you could probably make a game as fast in Unreal as you could in GameMaker. Like whenever I have an idea for some new shader or something, it takes me 10 minutes usually to like have that idea in a running game. And so with Unreal, I don't know exactly, but I have a feeling it takes longer.
Yeah, I would say too. Yeah, this is then of course on a different level concerning the complexity. All right, then what else do we got on the mobile dominance? Do we want to talk about that, or are we gonna skip it? How do you feel about that?
It's definitely interesting. I mean, I think the reason that mobile is becoming such a thing is because phones are being used all the time for everything. Like, everybody's got a phone, and everybody's got a phone on them that's powerful, that's got a nice, CPU and GPU. I mean, not so much on the GPU, but they're getting better. So it's definitely an interesting market because, you can create something that there's probably more mobile phones than there are desktop computers out there. I'm sure everybody's got a mobile phone. Yeah, so that's all I can say on that really is it's definitely a wide spanning market.
What would you say, will the mobile market basically just kill everybody off and basically everything will be a niche, or will be this just an extension and let's say the regular single player people will just say like, hey, I like my PC, my Mac or whatever, and then I want to go for single player. This is the old school way of the old school gamer. Is this a dying breed or do we just have then more for everybody in the end?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, this is going to be probably a bit controversial, but I think we're probably moving away from personal computing entirely. Like you're going to have, like the thing about phones is they're limited on hardware, but the limits are getting less and less. Like the hardware is fine. But I could imagine seeing a day where your phone is basically a screen with an internet connection and it goes to some supercomputer somewhere, and so as long as you have a good connection, you have all the computing power in the world. I could picture that becoming the next step, something that's extremely accessible, something you can carry on you that's really small, but it's linked to a computer elsewhere. And maybe it's going to be like a VR thing or augmented reality or something like that. But I can definitely see the potential for that because people want to be able to have it with them at all times. If you do AR, you don't have to have a limit to monitors or resolution or anything like that. It can be whatever size you want. You can be inside that world, inside a virtual world. So I think we're probably actually heading in that direction, of going beyond the accessibility of the smartphone to having some sort of tiny device that can do all the computing you want via cloud computing or whatever.
Okay.
Which would require more subscription models, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the thing. One question, of course, this is wild speculation. Will AR, so which stands for augmented reality, basically you see stuff which isn't there through a small screen. That stuff is already being used in medicine and military. Will this kind of replace the standard developer which is just in front of a regular screen? bring into...
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't. You know, like the big problem right now is accessibility. Like those things are really expensive, the hardware and all that stuff. If you can make those things more cheap, then I don't see why it wouldn't, because I don't know why. I'm kind of old-fashioned. I don't like the thought of it, but at the same time, I got to admit it's extremely efficient to not be limited by any monitors or resolutions or anything like that. As long as you have a good headset, you can have as many screens as you want. You can, you can interact in so many different ways. Like, it's kind of unfathomable. So I do think that's actually probably going to be the future, whether I like it or not. And then maybe some sort of like brain link to like type instead of typing. You can just think it, go right to your screen. I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of a scary thing.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of scary because there's definitely a lot of potential for like corruption and stuff there. But I don't see any forces that are going to prevent that. Like, it just makes more sense. It's more practical.
So what would you say, what kind of, this is once again very wild speculation, at which point will be AI that kind of good that, for example, you just say like, hey, I want a platformer, these graphics, that thing, and then that thing is just running, and after 2 seconds, basically you got a whole prototype done, which is making us redundant, by the way, and useless.
I'm not sure, and I'm not even sure if that would technically be possible. Maybe we'll discover long enough in researching AI that there's only so much AI can do. But then again, I could also see it going the other way, where once AI can figure out learning itself, it can just learn anything and grow beyond that. So I don't know. It's not a field that I'm very familiar with, but I could picture within 20 to 50 years something like that happening. And my job being obsolete, like, programming and stuff. You don't need to program if you just have an idea and you tell the computer to do it and it does it.
20 to
Which
50
I'll
years.
be very nostalgic for these days right now, where I'm actually writing code, because I like writing code, and someday that probably will be obsolete.
I wouldn't say completely, because the better the AI, or for example, the better the systems are, you still need the technicians which are, programming and twisting and not twisting and turning the knobs and so on. But of course...
But I mean, I can picture programming becoming more like recreational, almost as an art form, where you program, you do code golfing and challenges and things like that. And it's more of just for fun, because I don't know, it could get to the point where the code behind the AI is so sophisticated that any one person cannot comprehend it all. And that would be my concern there. It's like, if the AI gets super advanced and there's so much going on, it's not going to be something that a person can fix. It has to be fixed by an AI. That's like super speculation and all that, but that's what I'm thinking.
Okay. No, because I've seen like lots of talks about AI, and then they just said like AI is basically like a cockroach, and very stupid one. So it has some limits. But of course, it
yeah,
can do
right now, the tech is not very powerful, but I could foresee it. All you have to do is get over a hump of teaching it to learn, teaching it to teach itself, basically. If it can figure that out, that expands exponentially to any field, pretty much. And then you have super intelligence. So, yeah, that'd be interesting. We kind of went off topic, but that was
we definitely
really
went off topic. But it was, I thought like, hey, why not? All right, so I would say let's go to our last segue, which would be some shader stuff.
I'm interested in learning about like ray tracing techniques, going further down that rabbit hole. That's my next step. That's the thing that I'm working on, is going down lighting, shading. I love to do like a global illumination type of thing in GameMaker. I think that'd be neat. I don't think anybody's done it yet.
Global illumination? You mean 3D space or 2D space?
Yeah, 3D global illumination. I don't think I've ever seen that.
No, I've seen like some dude which did excellent shader for lighting, which is working extremely good. So you have like 5,000 light sources. It's not based on surfaces, but definitely on a shader. Maybe you've seen it. I don't know, some guy from Indonesia or somewhere else, but excellent content, by the way. So let's go over what do you want to show.
Okay,
of course.
So let's start with the voxel clips. I haven't showed this anywhere publicly yet, but I'm going to release it at some point.
Okay.
So this is a voxel system that I'm making. It has soft shadows that are completely dynamic. dynamic reflections. You can build and add stuff. You can destroy stuff. I don't know. I think it's really cool. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. It's not a game, but I'm just in it for the technology behind it, and I think it's really interesting.
Because voxel. Is this the new technology for low poly video games?
Yeah, this is a technology. This is my own algorithm that I'm developing. And instead of using polygons like Minecraft does, all of this is run in the shader, and all of it is voxel based. So there's no triangles involved. There's no typical ray casting algorithms. And the benefit to that is that I'm able to cast multiple rays at any given time in any place that I want. So the reflections, I can have reflections, I can have perfect shadows. All that stuff is actually ray traced, and I have all of the data contained, the entire algorithm contained in the shader, so I can cast rays however I want. Okay. I think that's a field that really needs a lot more research, is like voxel ray tracing or signed distance functions. The thing I'm using here is actually a hybrid between a ray marcher and a voxel ray tracer. Same system, but I just wanted to show it in an open slate where you have reflections, ambient occlusion, shadows, and then a 3D tiling effect. So it just goes on forever. Unfortunately, one of the biggest limitations I have right now is the size of the world. I can't make the world like really big, but I'm able to make it tile, so I can show that you can render like millions of voxels. That's not a problem.
Okay, cool.
And then right here, I just switched through a few different modes to show off, like with reflections off, shadows off, ambient occlusion off, and then the tiling off. Everything is completely dynamic.
Yeah, that one's amazing. That gives definitely some.
Yeah. So this is designed as a background for a game I'm working on called Numbos. It's kind of like I don't know if I can say that. Yeah, it's just the background part, but I spent a lot of time in working on the background, and I think it looks really cool. But yeah, these are just some fire effects that I made. There's a lot of post-processing effects going on, as you can tell. There's like a glow effect. There's some sort of glitch effect, which makes the edges jumble around. And then there's a chromatic aberration effect, which just splits the colors apart a little bit. So it's red on the left side and blue on the right side. And that just gives it a more like filmy depth look. I think that looks really neat.
How is the performance of such effects, if I may ask? So are they super lightning fast, or how is the computation?
It's decently fast. I'm sure it's not the fastest shader I've written. There are definitely ways to optimize it. I kind of threw it around for the looks first. It runs on my hardware well. Basically, it is multiple blur shaders compounded together. And that's how you do the glow effect. Is you start with a white circle in the center, and then you blur it and add that to the glow effect, and then you blur it again and add that and blur it and blur it and blur it. You do that like, I don't know, I think I did it like 9 times there. That part can be somewhat expensive. If I optimize my blur shader, that can be done pretty fast.
Is this the same as Bloom?
Yes. It's the same concept behind Bloom. Bloom is usually done a little bit differently, where they'll have a threshold value, so only certain colors above a certain brightness are contributing to the bloom effect at all. But I don't really like that look as much. I like the way that I'm doing it here because it's more of a gradual transition. It just kind of fades in. But yeah, it's a very similar concept.
Okay, interesting.
Now let's take a look at the 3D water shader. This is mostly a vertex shader. So basically I start with a 3D plane, and then I have a vertex shader which just goes and distorts each vertex, moves it up and down, side to side. And then I have a different shader the fragment shader part calculates the reflections, chooses the colors, and it's completely dynamic based off of a environment map. I think those are all the shader effects that I'm going to show today.
So that was definitely some impressive technology, and everything just based on shaders. So there's no, how could you call it? Because for some people, shaders are some gizmo. So basically you have a graphics, and then with the graphics you apply a shader. But for example, shaders itself can create graphical, not illusions, but graphical content. So I guess for beginners, of course, if they don't know the distinction.
Yeah, I guess I could give a quick overview about the difference between the CPU and the GPU, if anyone's interested. Like, the CPU is generally used for like the collision code, any of the gameplay code, all the background stuff, not to do with the visuals. The GPU is done to render everything, draw all the sprites and stuff. The older GPUs were not programmable, and so you basically just had to set certain functions that you could do. You could draw sprites, you could draw textures and things like that, but you were not able to get under the hood and change everything. Well, now, for the last 20 years or so, you can actually edit each vertex with a vertex shader, and that means you can move around the shape of objects, and that's what I use for the 3D water shader. I moved the vertices of the plane, and that's how I add in distortion. And then it's fragment shader, and the fragment shader just runs for every single pixel. So instead of just sampling a texture in a square, you're able to distort the texture however you want. You can add in multiple textures, you can move them around and change the colors. The sky's the limit with the fragment shader. So all of these only use the vertex shader or fragment shader. There are other types of shaders that GameMaker does not have access to. At some point, hopefully they'll expand that, and maybe I'll play around with that then. But at this point, you can do a lot with just vertex and fragment shaders.
Then, for example, in a nutshell, correct me if I summarized it wrong. So, for example, if you see a CPU, basically this is a sequential command, like do some calculations here and there, and then, for example, the GPU, I guess, does the brute force, but everything at once. So basically, this is in a nutshell CPU.
Absolutely.
GPU.
Yeah. So CPUs are really good at complicated tasks that involve a lot of data. Shaders are more limited in their bandwidth, so it has a harder time when you're processing tons of information, but it's really good at taking simple tasks and doing it a million times simultaneously. And so that's why my voxel system and things like that are good, because I have a really simple algorithm that just repeats like 100 times, 200 times, something like that. And then you just run that for every single pixel. The part that gets complicated is when you have a really large map size or a lot of data coming into the shader, like light, like if I had 1,000 point lights in the shader, I would have to get creative with how I do it, because that's a lot of data every single pixel has to process. So it is interesting. It takes a different style of thinking about programming to make it work. The difference between parallel computing and sequential computing.
Yeah, this is a thing which most people actually don't do. Most people just do sequential, so one line of command, then the other, then the other, then the other. But here you need to do everything at once. So this is kind of a thing. So one last question for you. For example, if people are interested in shaders and doing some screen magic, what would you say to them? How long would be a journey to not master, but become proficient enough?
Okay, well, I do have a website, gmshaders.com. That's a great starting place, in my humble opinion, for learning shaders. I have a 4-part series that goes from complete beginner to knowing everything about the language. Now, there's a lot more to shader learning beyond just the syntax and everything like that. That comes with practice and time. But I am writing more tutorials for that gradually. I have a few more in the works. And so that will help. And then the other thing too is, once you have the language down and you understand the basics, Shader Toy is an amazing resource. You go to Shader Toy, you can look at hundreds of examples, you can dissect the code. Some people put lots of comments and explain how everything works. And so I would recommend just having fun with it and taking your time and experimenting. If you want to do 3D stuff, start with ray marching. IQ has some insane examples that are really easy to understand, easy to get into, but it lets you do powerful stuff you can't do any other way. And then down the line, you can look into voxel tracing and ray tracing and different algorithms. Those ones are more complicated, but start with ray marching.
Is there anything you would like to give or say before we end this thing? at least officially?
I'm pretty happy with that. Basically.
All right, then it was definitely a good talk. Thank you for being on board. And if people or my audience say like, hey, you would like to have a second interview on some specifics, hey, please write that down in the comments. And of course, the links to all his sources and all his websites and Twitter and so on, so of course, will be in there. So if you want to contact him or just want to check out his stuff and you want to be the next graphical wizard, then of course you are more than welcome. Alrighty, then you got the last word.
Thank you very much for having me.